turn it up and jump in the deep end on perspectives. Now, here's Ashley.
Welcome back live to Live Your True Life Perspectives, and I'm your host, Ashley Berges. On today, we're talking about genealogy. We're talking about history, about family history, and understanding who you're related to and who you're not. Right before the break, Dan was actually telling me about, I was asking some information about George Washington, and if he knew anybody that was connected to George, and you were bringing up the Stevenson brothers. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So actually what happened was my grandmother's cousin was still alive when I started working on the Stevenson family, and he said that George Washington used to hang out with these Stevenson brothers. They were in the war with them, and they grew up together. And you're like, sure, right? You know, he also said we were related to Adlai Stevenson, which we were not. But, you know, anytime I sort of view it as like putting a puzzle together, and you get pieces that fit and pieces that don't, but the more pieces you collect, the more likely you'll get it to look like the top of the puzzle box. And so I sort of kept that note, and I followed up on it, and sure enough, I came across a magazine article that referred to the Stevenson brothers. Sometimes they're called Stinson brothers. Those were sort of interchangeable back in the day, that lived with George Washington. So I followed the stories, and sure enough, back in Fredericksburg, Virginia, him and his mom lived with a Stinson family, and they grew up, you know, sort of that age when boys are wrestling and, you know, Indian wrestling and fighting and, you know, sort of developing their early manhood. They were all together. So that was pretty interesting. But I haven't figured out how to get from those Stevensons to my furthest back 1799 Stevenson in Virginia. So still working on that. I was at the Library of Virginia just this past month, working on it more. So
that's really interesting. I want to ask you about Mobsters in a second, but I do have a question for you. How do you get started, you know, in a career like this? I mean, because this is not your mainstay career. You know, I've actually not ever run up against anybody that's ever done it before. You're the first. So how did you fall into this? Yeah,
it's sort of random. I think there's some DNA, you know, as I said, from my great-great-grandfather, and then my friends, and they mean it as friends, think I have a weird brain because I can keep track of all these different families. I've got 6 projects going right now, and I have to keep track of all those different families. You know, we've done 53 books, and yet I can, if I talk to the client about somebody in their family, or if something seems familiar and I'll say, I've done this family before, I'll go look at my narrative that captures it all and find that, yep, that was right. I did research this family before, and connects back, saves the client some time because I already have researched that family. So I did this all before the internet for my own family and my wife's family. And so I think that made me a better researcher, because before the internet, it wasn't easy. I mean, you had to spend time in libraries. You had to call people. They had landlines, so that helped, you know, and you'd call people in towns that people lived in that had similar last names. You'd write letters. There were a lot of bulletins, you know, the Berges family book, or the, you know, those kinds of things. So you'd spend a lot of time checking places out. I traveled a lot for my career job, and so that allowed me to go to a lot of places where I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have that kind of position. So I just kept building and doing more and more. But the great thing about what sort of led me to have it be a career is I'd go on backpacking trips with guys of mine in the business world, and when you're on a backpacking trip or a fishing trip or whatever, you just run out of stuff to talk about. So I'd share some of the wilder stories from family history, and so one of the guys on the trip said, hey, I'd like you to research my wife's family. And sure, I'll do that, and I'm envisioning stapling some papers together and all. He says, no, I want to pay you to do it. So I thought, oh, if he wants to pay me, I better figure out how to do it professionally. So that's when we got together, and me and my wife figured out how to do the books. And so we've continued to do the books. And we practiced on our own family to get all the lessons you learn when you become a publisher and when you become a family historian that's, you know, doing it for pay. And so that's sort of how it just evolved from there. And now we've done 53 books. So let's move along.
That's a lot, 53 books.
Yep.
Golly, that's interesting. I just think it's really powerful. I've never done any of this as a checkup, and it's interesting. I have my own ideas on the spit test thing. You know, even before it came out that a lot of the information was being sold to, you know, pharmaceutical companies and everything to get information on drug information. I kind of knew that was the direction it was going, so I got scared. So you're doing it like the legitimate way, which I think is very interesting. Let me ask you, Mobsters. Let's talk about that. You know, because the Al Capones, the different folks like that, even the Italian mobsters, there's mobsters in every country, but have you come across any of that in lineage?
Yeah, actually, in a family I worked on, it was interesting because I think they sort of knew that there was some dubious characters in the past, but fortunately, a lot of their stuff made the newspaper, and this was a Hungarian Jewish family out of Cleveland, and they were barbers. Well, then during Prohibition, they came up with a scheme where they were going to import hair oil from Canada. It was called Millionaire Hair Tonic, but it wasn't hair tonic, it was alcohol. So they brought it into the United States, sold it, and interestingly made $1 million on their Millionaire Hair Tonic before they got caught by the federal government. So, and the other grandpa was a lawyer, and so he defended them. They got sent to jail, and one of the brothers, while he was in prison, he actually murdered somebody, so he had a longer sentence. And so he, as the prison barber, was sharpening his razor on the strap, and all of a sudden he slit his own throat, I guess so he didn't have to do the time, and killed himself. But there was one good brother, it was the Arbeck family, and he moved out to Salt Lake City and started his own barber shop, which, turned into more. And but he always liked sports. You don't really think about somebody, a barber, getting into the sports world, but he was Jack Dempsey, the world champion's first agent. And when I first sort of came across this, a lot of stories I come across, I'm a little bit dubious about, is this just a convenient story or is there actually truth to it? Well, sure enough, I found a newspaper article where Jack Dempsey stopped into Provo and got a mani-pedi with Al Arbeck, and talked about their good times together, because Jack Dempsey started in Salt Lake City. So that was sort of a cool story for that family.
That's really interesting. I mean, it really is. In some of these situations, it's like finding that that Superman comic one of one, and the acid-free archival paper up in the attic, and you go, wow, because it kind of is like that when you think about that kind of the connection that we have. So you started Ancestors. What do you think is really unique about what you do and about your company?
I think there's several features, but one of the key ones is my wife just has a casual interest in history and genealogy. So she serves as my editor and my art director, and what's really good is she makes sure that we're making it a product that the average person will enjoy. Genealogists, just like any other profession, have a tendency to write things a certain way, but they may not be that meaningful to regular folks. So she works real hard at making sure that I bust all that up and it's very clear and make it entertaining. Secondly, a lot of my clients have been big, business leaders and really busy people. And so I work as the project manager and do it. I don't come to them and ask all these questions and, take away more of their limited time. I say, what do you want? We talk about it, we agree, and then I go do it and then come back. They get as much interaction as they want during the process, but if they say, hey, just let me know when you're done, it works that way. So it keeps it easy for busy people. The other thing is nobody has to pay until they're satisfied. They get to completely electronically preview the book. We make any changes that they want, and when they're ready, we publish it, and then they pay. So I'm not asking people for a bunch of money up front, and then, it doesn't meet expectations or something like that. And that's just because I'm so... I think everybody's been so thrilled with the books we've done. I mean, one of the great things about being in this business is typically when we deliver the product to the client, it results in tears of joy. It's a great emotional moment for the family, to get their story.
That's cool. I like that. And it's cool that, you kind of do all that work and you have that dedication and determination to do that. I think it's interesting. I mean, I think most people kind of feel like, like you said, the guy said, well, I think everybody's probably a farmer in my family, or it's not that interesting. And then some of us have, major beliefs that we must be related to, some major person, and it goes back to, I guess, kind of, have you ever had anybody that, I guess, was a little like the wind got out of their sail? Like they really were just related to shopkeepers and farmers.
Yeah, I actually had two guys in a business group that I was in. Both had the same last name, and it wasn't James, but they both grew up hearing that they were related to Jesse James. And one actually grew up in near St. Joseph, Missouri, so he had more of a basis. But turned out neither of them were related to Jesse James. So yeah, that sort of burst their bubble. I had another client that there was some things that came true and some didn't. She grew up hearing that her great-great-great-grandpa invented the potato chip. Well, he was born after the American version of the potato chip was invented, so that didn't seem very likely. So it's like, okay, is this just not a real story? But I kept digging and digging and digging, and sure enough, and this guy's name was John Addison Smith. So John Smith, or John A. Smith, isn't exactly where you like to start. But in 1888, in the San Francisco Fair, he was noted for producing the first not only efficient potato chip making machine, but one that was clean and sanitary. And that was a big deal in 1888 to get food out of a machine that wasn't touched by human hands. So they put the potato in, and out comes the fried potato chips. So in fact, the story she heard growing up was relatively accurate. He did invent the modern potato chip making machine, and went on to produce those in a packing house. And so it was sort of cool to have that one validated. But another story was his son supposedly married a Sears heiress, and they had a baby, and the mom was killed in a polo accident. And so the Sears family took the baby and went to Europe and raised it, but he was always sad because he had a stopwatch with teething marks in it, and he said it was the baby's teething marks, and so it always made him sad. So I followed up on that story. Well, first of all, none of the Sears heiresses were the right age to match up with that. And then I continued to work it and work it. Turns out he married the daughter of somebody in the Dumble family, which was a retailer in Bakersfield. So not quite, Sears level of retail, but they were retailers. And sadly, yes, the wife did die. I never found anything about a polo accident. And you could only search so many places for polo accident. But the baby was raised by the grandparents. So he basically abandoned the child versus, taken to Europe kind of thing, and went to sea. And he had a great time at sea. He was sailed around the world with the Dewar's Label founder, George Dewars, I think it was, in a yacht. And they got caught on a sandbar, and pirates raided the ship, and he had to find his way home. But I found a book that had it all in there. So, it was like the goods and the bads. So she handled it pretty well because a lot of the stories turned out to be very accurate. Some of the others didn't,
That's interesting. When we were trying to be talking more about some of these stories and getting into this, because this is really interesting information. So stick with us, because Dan's going to continue here on our next segment talking more about this, about ancestry, genealogy, and the list goes on. So stay tuned, because Live Your True Life Perspectives with your host, me, Ashley Berges, will be back in. I'll be back this time. You know it. I'll be back this time in 2 shakes.